Welcome back to the deep dive. We are tackling a subject today that, on the surface, sounds pretty unnerving.
Mhm.
It's a concept used across philosophy, art, psychology for centuries, really. We're doing a deep dive into Thanatophilia.
Thanatophilia.
Now, you look at that word and you kind of break it down, right? Thanatos, Greek for death, and philia, love or attraction.
The love of death.
We are literally talking about the love of death. But the surprising core idea our sources kept hitting on is that this isn't just, being morbid.
Okay.
It's actually defined as a positive orientation toward death, dying, or even non-existence itself.
And that's really our mission today, isn't it? To unpack that orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Because when people hear love of death, they immediately think, well, pathology or suicide.
Exactly.
But Thanatophilia, when you look at it as a philosophical stance or maybe an aesthetic one, it's much broader. It's about viewing death as potentially beautiful, desirable, maybe liberating.
Yeah.
Even as the sort of ultimate culmination.
An embrace of mortality as intrinsically positive, then?
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the philosophy, the psychology, the culture, and see how this desire for cessation for the end has actually driven some really profound human ideas.
Where do we start? Philosophy.
Yeah, let's start with philosophy, because here's where it gets really interesting. For most people, philosophy is about living well, right? How to have a good life.
Mm-hmm.
So why would some of the deepest thinkers argue that death, or even the desire for non-existence, is actually a positive principle that feels backward?
Well, what's fascinating here is how often the philosophical case for Thanatophilia frames death as the ultimate liberation.
Liberation from what?
From life itself. These traditions often start from the premise that life is inherently flawed,
Yeah.
maybe driven by endless desire, constant suffering,
Yeah.
the drill.
The pessimism angle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If life is fundamentally, let's say, a bad deal, then maybe death is the only truly good outcome left.
Ah.
And our sources point right to thinkers like Schopenhauer, the German pessimists. For him, the universe is run by this blind, irrational force, the will to live. It just keeps us striving, suffering, never satisfied.
So if the will is the engine driving all this suffering.
Then death is the only way to switch the engine off. Yeah.
Wow.
So for Schopenhauer, death wasn't just something to accept grimly. It was seen as a positive release from this relentless will, a necessary end almost.
Did he connect that to suicide?
He did note the thanatophilic impulse behind it, yeah, but he actually argued suicide was ineffective in a way.
How so?
Because it only destroys the individual's manifestation of the will. It doesn't stop the underlying will to live that permeates everything.
So it's a symptom, not a cure for the universe's problem.
Something like that. True release, for him, required the cessation of the will itself.
That is heavy stuff. Okay, so moving from pessimism, what about existentialism? Because there, death shifts, right? It goes from being an escape from suffering to something that actually somehow creates meaning.
Yeah, that's Heidegger.
How does he make that leap? It seems so counterintuitive. Death gives life meaning.
Well, what's fascinating there is Heidegger links mortality directly to living an authentic life. His big concept is being toward death.
Being toward death.
Yeah, death is the one absolute certainty we all face, and it's uniquely ours. You can't delegate your death, right? Can't share it. So by constantly confronting this singular, definite end, we're sort of forced to realize how precious and finite our choices are.
Ah, okay. It puts things in perspective.
Exactly. Recognizing death, for Heidegger, strips away all the superficial stuff, the societal pressures, the just going along with the crowd, what he called the they-self.
Right.
And it compels us, or should compel us, to live authentically, based on our own real possibilities. So embracing death isn't morbid. It's embracing the very condition that makes a meaningful life possible.
So it's an affirmation of being, but seen through the lens of non-being. Paradoxical.
Very much so.
And looking beyond the West, our sources also connect this pull towards cessation with ideas like nirvana in Buddhism.
Absolutely. While Buddhism is fundamentally about ending suffering, the ultimate goal, nirvana, well, it involves dissolving the individual self, escaping that endless cycle of rebirth.
Getting off the wheel.
Right. And that carries a really profound thanatophilic impulse, doesn't it? It's a deep yearning for the ego to cease, for individualized existence to end, and to return to some kind of ultimate stillness.
A positive orientation towards non-existence again.
It's perfectly.
Okay, so we've got philosophy framing death as meaning or liberation. Now let's pivot to psychology. Because here, the idea emerges that this might not just be a philosophical choice, but maybe a deep, unconscious, fundamental drive.
And you can't talk about that without talking about Freud.
Thanatos.
Exactly. He proposed these two fundamental opposing forces. You have eros, the life instinct drives us toward connection, creation, preserving ourselves.
Right, the drive to live, basically.
And then you have its opposite, Thanatos, the death drive.
I think people know Eros, the connection to eroticism is obvious, but Thanatos often feels a bit more vague. What exactly did Freud mean by a death drive?
Well, Freud saw Thanatos as this inherent tendency within all living things, almost a pull to revert back to an inorganic state.
Back to simplicity, stillness.
Precisely, an unconscious pull towards destruction, maybe aggression, but ultimately a return to absolute stillness and rest. The peace, if you like, of the inanimate.
Wow.
And this deep fundamental yearning for cessation, this desire for the ego to just dissolve.
Wow.
That's the core of Thanatophilia from a Freudian view. It helps explain why the idea of peaceful rest or non-striving can be so incredibly attractive to us.
And that pull, that yearning for cessation, often gets romanticized, doesn't it? Especially in certain psychological states, like dealing with intense pain or depression.
Oh, absolutely. In those contexts, death isn't just seen as, the end of suffering. It can be imagined as something beautiful or poetic or just profoundly restful.
An idealized solution.
Yeah, exactly. The person pictures non-existence as this calm harbor, not a scary void. That kind of romanticization, it's a textbook psychological manifestation of thanatophilic thinking.
We should probably also just briefly clarify the specific technical definition sometimes used in clinical psychology.
Good point, yes. In a very narrow sense, thanatophilia can refer to an eroticized attraction to death or its symbols.
Which is different from necrophilia.
Very different, and it's crucial to make that distinction. Necrophilia is strictly a sexual attraction to corpses. Thanatophilia, even in this narrower psychological sense, covers a much wider spectrum of positive attraction towards death itself, including the aesthetic and philosophical stuff we're talking about.
Okay. So moving beyond the internal mind, the individual psyche, let's look at how this positive attraction shows up culturally. When does this fascination with death become like a recognizable aesthetic people actually seek out?
Culturally, Thanatophilia has given us some incredibly compelling art. Just look back historically. The Romantic movement, late 18th, early 19th centuries, they absolutely idealized death. Death was seen as like the highest form of drama, the ultimate sublime experience, peak emotion.
Right. You think of all the poetry focusing on the tragic heroine who dies young and beautiful.
Yes.
Or the sublime graveyard scene depicted as a place of peaceful reflection, not just sadness.
It was everywhere. Poets like Keats, grappling with tuberculosis himself, wrote about being half in love with easeful death. Death wasn't something to hide. It was a central, often beautiful character in their literature and art, representing purity, maybe, or the end of suffering, or even transcendence.
And that aesthetic appreciation for melancholy, for ruin, for mortality, it's still really powerful today, isn't it?
Absolutely. You see it strongly in contemporary subcultures.
Like goth.
Goth, dark wave, certain kinds of black metal. They embrace the imagery of death, decay, darkness. But often it's not coming from a place of simple morbidity. It's an aesthetic choice.
An appreciation.
Yeah, an appreciation for the sublime power of mortality, maybe the beauty found in ruin, the emotional depths of melancholy. It's a very aestheticized cultural form of thanatophilia.
And then maybe on a more modern, practical level, this relates to the death positive movement too, doesn't it?
It does connect, yes. The death positive movement is really about encouraging people to embrace death as natural, trying to strip away the cultural taboos so we can talk about mortality openly.
Make it less scary.
Exactly. Now, it doesn't necessarily glorify death in the same way romanticism might have, but by normalizing and encouraging acceptance, by removing the fear, it kind of creates the groundwork for any positive orientation toward it. It helps shift the conversation away from seeing death only as a failure or a catastrophe.
Okay, that makes sense.
But this brings up a really important question before we get into the modern ethical side. How is this love of death, thanatophilia, actually different from just accepting death? Because that distinction feels crucial ethically and psychologically.
Wait, hang on. Isn't that just splitting hairs? I mean, if I accept that death is inevitable, haven't I basically done the hard work already?
Not quite. And that's the critical nuance that our sources really draw out. Think about Stoicism, for instance.
Okay.
The Stoics accepted death calmly, rationally. They saw it as inevitable, a neutral part of nature, neither good nor bad, just is. They aim to prepare for it emotionally, mentally.
Right. Face it without fear.
But thanatophilia goes a step further than acceptance. It introduces an element of, well, positive desire, or even glorification.
Ah,
If you're coming from a thanatophilic perspective, you don't just endure death, you might actually view it as superior to life in some way, or aesthetically magnificent, or the ultimate release. It's the difference between saying, okay, this has to happen, and saying, I kind of wish for this to happen because it's better.
got it. That makes the related ethical concepts much clearer now. Our sources mention several worldviews that seem to share this underlying preference for non-existence.
Yeah, these worldviews aren't thanatophilia itself, but you could say thanatophilia often provides the the emotional or philosophical underpinning that makes their conclusions feel acceptable or even desirable.
Like antinatalism.
Like antinatalism, exactly. The ethical argument against having children because life inherently contains suffering that you can't avoid imposing.
Mm,
So the non-existence of a potential person is seen as preferable.
that preference for non-existence again.
hmm Or you look at extinctionism, the idea advocating for the extinction of humanity, whether voluntarily or just accepting it as a natural outcome.
Wow.
The thanatophilic impulse can be present there in accepting human cessation as a positive thing, maybe even ecologically necessary, a relief for the planet.
And then there was pro-mortalism.
Right, the belief that dying sooner is actually ethically better because it avoids potential future suffering. These are definitely hard concepts, but they're all rooted fundamentally in this idea that non-existence is somehow preferable to continued existence.
Which brings us right to the criticisms.
Absolutely. Because when you move into actively glorifying death, critics understandably get very worried about, well, the slippery slope.
I can see that immediately. If death is constantly framed as beautiful, liberating, doesn't that risk blurring into an unhealthy romanticization of suicide or even violence?
That's the primary concern. Critics argue that glamorizing death can be genuinely dangerous, especially for people who are already vulnerable.
And there's a deeper ethical risk too, isn't there?
There is. If death itself is seen as inherently good or desirable, does that undermine our fundamental moral obligations, our duty to preserve life, protect others from harm? That tension between seeing death positively and the practical, moral imperative to live and protect life, that's where the real conflict lies.
So for the listener, it's important to distinguish.
Yes, the sources really emphasize the risk of misinterpretation. We need to actively distinguish between, say, acceptance of death, which is generally seen as a mature, psychologically healthy stance, and the actual love of death, or its glorification. That needs critical attention because it might signal something deeper, maybe a pathology.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together, the philosophy, the psychology, the cultural stuff, what does this orientation, thanatophilia, actually mean for us today? Where do we see these undercurrents playing out now in modern debates or culture?
Well, connecting it to the bigger picture, you see it pretty directly in debates around end-of-life ethics.
Ah, like euthanasia.
Exactly. Movements supporting euthanasia, or medically assisted dying, or even just dignified death, they often frame the eventual passing not just as an unfortunate necessity, but sometimes as a positive, merciful release, especially from chronic, incurable suffering.
Tapping into that liberation idea from philosophy.
Like directly. And then thinking bigger on a planetary scale.
Yeah.
Pops up in some environmental discussion.
Cause
There's a certain strain of, let's call it eco-pessimism, that can feel profoundly thanatophilic. It might view human extinction or an ecological collapse not as the ultimate tragedy, but almost as a beautiful natural return.
like the planet healing itself by getting rid of us.
Something like that, yeah. The aesthetic appreciation of ruin we talked about, that can feed into this kind of thinking.
And just look at contemporary media. The fascination is everywhere, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
The sheer number of apocalyptic themes, the aesthetic of decaying cities, ruin porn, the popularity of stories that focus on quiet, dignified endings rather than, endless heroic striving.
Yeah.
That strong undercurrent of thanatophilia, it seems to be shaping the narratives we use to make sense of our own finite time here.
So to wrap up,
To wrap up, I'd say thanatophilia is this really complex, multi-layered orientation. It's rooted in deep psychological drives, explored in profound philosophical traditions, and it views death not just as life's endpoint, but as a potentially positive concept.
as beautiful, liberating, desirable, exactly.
Like
It's
that.
far more than just morbidity. It's actually a serious and maybe enduring lens through which humans grapple with the big questions: mortality, suffering, and that core search for meaning itself.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, based on all this. If thanatophilia seriously proposes that death can be desirable or liberating, how does that perspective challenge, maybe fundamentally shift, the value our society usually places on simply preserving life at all costs? If death can be seen as a form of transcendence, where does that leave our moral fight against mortality itself? Something for you to mull over.